Okay. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. This is the very first inaugural online Peace Science Colloquium meeting. So the idea of this series is that Peace Science wants to be able to share new research that's ongoing all throughout the year. It gives people a chance to see new stuff and and we can get feedback from the for the authors, etc. So our very first presentation of these new colloquia is entitled Not in My Backyard, Public Perceptions and Terrorism. And we're joined today by the authors, Nazli Avdan and Clayton Webb, both assistant professors at the University of Kansas. And we also have joining us today 3 discussants who have volunteered their time to read the paper and prepare some feedback for the authors. And we have Brian Phillips, who's an assistant professor at CDE in Mexico City. We have Jim Piazza, who's an associate professor at Penn State University, and we also have Steve Miller, an assistant professor at Clemson. So what we're going to do today is we'll have a 15-minute presentation from the authors. This is the way that, so that people who are watching who have not read the paper and who will watch afterwards be able to get a sense of what the research is even without having read it. And so that presentation will go for 15 minutes, and then we're going to break our discussant comments up into 3 sections. So the first section will have discussants talk about framing and contribution suggestions that they might have for the authors for 15 minutes. The authors will respond. We'll have discussion on the theory of the project. The authors will respond, and then we'll also talk about research design and empirical analysis, and the authors will respond. So if it turns out that needs to flex, we can do that, but that's the general idea of what we're going to do. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nazli and Clayton.
All right. Well, thanks for participating in this very first endeavor for the Peace Science Colloquium. So I'll get started here, and then I will be handing over to my colleague, Clay. So our paper is entitled Not in My Backyard, Public Perceptions and Terrorism. In this paper, we ask, why does the public care more about some terrorist events than others? So consider these 3 motivating cases. On April 2nd, 2015, at Garissa University College, Garissa, Kenya, Al-Shabaab staged an attack which killed 147 and wounded 79 more. On October 10th, 2015, in Ankara, Turkey, ISIS blew up 2 bombs which killed 97 and left 400 wounded. And then in Paris, France, on November 13th, 2015, ISIS orchestrated a series of coordinated attacks which killed 130 and wounded 367. Now, all 3 attacks occurred in the same year, 2015. All 3 were transnational. In all 3 cases, the perpetrators of these attacks were Islamic militants. In fact, ISIS staged 2 of these attacks. The targets of these attacks were civilians. Each of the attacks killed at least 100 or approximately 100 and wounded many more. Now, in 2 of the cases, the tactics employed were small arms, and 2 of the locations, the venues, Ankara and Paris, are the capitals of these countries. Yet, neither Garissa nor Ankara received the amount of international attention that Paris did. So consider the public reaction and the international outcry that followed. Facebook users all across the world changed their profile overlays to the colors of the French flag. Now, Facebook also activated its safety check feature, which had only been previously used during natural disasters. Celebrities across the world expressed sympathy, and people held vigils. Different countries of the world lit up their national monuments in the colors of the French flag. Now, what explains this discrepancy? Also consider the weekly Google searches for terrorism. So this is another way to gauge public interest. The dashed line, the vertical lines here, depict the dates of these attacks, and then the solid line depicts the number of Google searches for the keyword terrorism. The week with the most searches is at 100%, and then everything else is scaled accordingly. So the week after the Paris attack, we witnessed a surge, and then right after, there's a second peak. Neither Garissa nor Ankara experienced a comparable surge, and in fact, the number of searches declined in the weeks following Garissa and Ankara. Clear discrepancy. which leads to our research question: why does the public care more about some terrorist attacks than others? Our answer is that the features of these terrorist attacks influence threat perception and affect public support for counterterrorism policies. We draw on two key pieces of literature. Number one, psychology of attitudes toward terrorism, and number two, public opinion and security policy. Now, within the first literature, scholars have concentrated on the distance of the respondent from the target of attack as a key determinant of threat perception. People who are closer to attack sites are likely to have been exposed to terrorist incidents, either directly through personal exposure or indirectly through friends, family, and acquaintances. Proximate attacks are also vivid and therefore evoke a visceral reaction. Now, turning to the second piece of literature, scholars have contended that casualty sensitivity matters for support for war. In fact, as the casualty count mounts up, the support for war and for leadership declines. Other scholars have analyzed attitudes toward terrorism as a determinant of support for counterterrorism and as for whether the public is willing to support restrictions on civil liberties. Yet other scholars have extended these insights to studying chronic terrorism, that is, studying public reaction in societies such as Israel that are afflicted by recurring terrorism. Psychologists have also identified different emotive responses in response to terrorist violence, and that these responses in turn are linked to different demands for concessions versus aggressive policies. For example, anxiety is linked more readily to a demand for conciliatory policy, for concessions, and whereas threat perception is linked to a demand for an aggressive response. We believe that threat perception is a function of both physical and personal proximity. Now, physical proximity is about the location of the event. Here, we distinguish between attacks that occur close to home or on the territory of the country versus attacks that occur abroad. Attacks that are closer to home are both more proximate and more salient. Now, personal proximity turns on affinity with the victims. The more affinity, the more personally proximate, and thus more salient. There is also an objective component here in the sense that I'm likely to feel threatened if individuals who are similar to me have been targets of attacks. But there's also a symbolic component in that I might regard these attacks as a threat, as a challenge against my community at large, my in-group, and my way of life. Therefore, we have the next two set of hypotheses. Number one, we expect physical proximity, and number two, we expect personal proximity, both to be positively related to the perceived threat of the terrorist attack. Now, in terms of our theoretical model, we expect two features of attacks: the location, the venue of the attack, and the type of victims to affect threat perception, which in turn affects policy preferences. Now, in terms of policy preferences of the public toward counterterrorism, literature has advanced two competing models. Number one, the rational choice approach, and number two, correspondence theory. The rational choice approach believes that terrorism is effective insofar as it's able to inflict costs upon the target state, thereby manipulate the cost-benefit calculations of the target state and force concessions. Here, casualties are costly for states, and by inflicting casualties, the terrorist organization can signal resolve and capabilities. So casualties are expected to produce concessions. Abrams has challenged this traditional approach and posited correspondence theory instead. Abrams argues that terrorism is ineffective because it's a poor communication tactic. Number one, if you target non-combatants, this is considered taboo by the public, and therefore the public will focus on the pain inflicted, that is the means, and ignore the ends of these groups. The public will also believe that the group has maximalist aims and is unlikely to cease violence when the demands are met. These components render target governments intransigent and aggressive. Regardless of which model holds, we also believe that the personal and physical proximity will affect the pressure placed on governments to respond to salient threats. So we have the next set of hypotheses. If the rational choice model is correct, if Pape and Lake are correct, we would expect H3 to hold. That is, people are more likely to support concessions when terrorist attacks result in the deaths of their compatriots, their nationals. Alternatively, if Abrams's correspondence theory is correct, we have H4 concerning concessions. People are more likely to support concessions when terrorists attack civilian targets. And again, Abrams's theory has implications for counterterrorism because target governments become both more intransigent and aggressive. People are more likely to support counterterrorism measures when terrorists attack civilian targets. We also add to this by saying that personal and physical proximity matters. That is, people are more likely to support a counterterrorism response if these terrorist attacks occur on the territory of the target state. Now, regardless of which model holds, that is, regardless of whether correspondence theory or rational choice theory is correct, the valences of policy preferences should be determined both by personal and physical proximity. This leads to our final two hypotheses. In hypothesis 7, we expect that people are more likely to support concessions when terrorists attack military personnel that share their nationality than when terrorists attack military personnel that do not share their nationality. And similarly, if we consider civilian targets, we have a similar expectation. In H8, we contend that people are, again, more likely to support counterterrorism policies when terrorists attack civilians that share their nationality than when terrorists attack civilians that do not share their nationality. And with that, I will turn it over to Clay.
Surprisingly difficult. Okay. All right. So, to test the hypotheses, our first experiment, well, for this particular paper, is a 2x2 between group design with one nested factor. In each of the scenarios, there's a Portuguese terrorist group, the Fighters for the Liberation of Portugal, who claim responsibility for an attack on an Air Force base. They kill 5 people when they attack a bridge, and 33 are wounded, and they demand the United States remove all of its military personnel from Portuguese territory. As it turns out, there's only one place where U.S. military personnel are in Portuguese territory, which is the Lajes Air Force Base. And so we vary the two main experimental factors are the location and the victims. The location can either be in the United States or Portugal. If it's in the United States, the attack occurs in Charleston, South Carolina. If it is in Portugal, it happens in Lajes in the Azores. The victims is a second factor. They're either civilian or military victims. If it's civilian, then a tourist group is attacked. If it's military, then an Air Force convoy is attacked. And the nested factor is the nationality of the victims. They're either U.S. nationals or Portuguese nationals. After manipulation checks, we had 225 participants from an Amazon Mechanical Turk survey that participated in the experiment. The individuals were given a URL, and they were randomly selected into one of 6 experimental conditions. Either the attack was domestic or international. The attacks were against civilian or military targets, and and then the victims were either Portuguese or American. The first set of questions they are then asked are questions about their perceived threat and their support for policies. The second questionnaire, there's a series of demographic questions we ask about their income, where they live in the country, and then we have manipulation checks. Finally, they're given a debriefing form where they're sort of explained that this is just a social science experiment. There is no such terrorist organization as the Fighters for the Liberation of Portugal, so you need not be worried about traveling there. So here are the questions we used to gauge threat perception. The first is basic. How do you rate the seriousness of the attack, the threat against the United States? But we include threat to the U.S. in the future, threat to the public in the future, to get a sense that is it a difference between a national threat or a threat against civilians? Is it prospective or is it retrospective? We include personal travel and personal threat to see if there's any difference if we ask questions that are supposed to key in on anxiety. So here's the first set of results. The horizontal dimension of the table shows the country and the nationality of the groups, and the vertical dimension shows whether the casualties were civilian or military. In this full experiment, there's no interaction between the experimental factors, the casualties in the country, and whether or not the casualties were civilian or military did not have a significant effect, but the location of the attacks was significant. So people, when the attacks occurred in America, they were perceived as more threatening. If we look at just attacks where U.S. nationals are killed, so this would be the country is either, the location of the attack is either the United States or Portugal, and the casualties are either civilian or military. That, again, the difference between civilian and military is not statistically significant. There is no interaction, but the location is significant when you just look at U.S. nationals. If we look at international events, then we can compare just the nationality of the victims. There's no difference between civilian and military casualties, but the threat is more, it's perceived as more threatening when U.S. nationals are attacked instead of Portuguese nationals. So we want to test this, including a series of controls for demographics, age, income, part of the country that you're from, political variables. We have your political party affiliation. We also have a variable on foreign policy proclivity, whether they perceive themselves as being hawkish or dovish. And then we have a series of controls that we include for knowledge about political events. How much time do you spend reading the news? How much time do you spend reading international news? How much do you know about Portugal? Have you ever been the victim of or witnessed a terrorist attack, to see if any of those things would influence their responses. For the sake of presentation, all those controls are omitted, but the inferences we get are similar when we make the basic comparisons. The first column shows the coding for the independent variables. So the country variable is coded 0 if it's in the US, 1 if it's Portugal. Along the horizontal dimension, you get the different questions that were asked for threat perception. And
2 minutes,
so
Clay.
Okay, thank you. The negative coefficient suggests that the attacks in the United States are perceived as more threatening. The negative coefficient for the nationality variable shows that across the different threat perception variables, attacks against U.S. nationals were more threatening. We ask a series of questions about policy response. So first, a general question, should there be a response at all? A second question about should we remove. Recall that the demands made by the terrorist organization is that the U.S. remove all of its military personnel from Portugal. So to respond by removing is to concede to the terrorist threat. Then increasing troops is the opposite, and we have a series of domestic policy questions that we ask. Here are the responses, and for the sake of time, we'll just move to the regressions because you can sort of better observe the results here. But again, there's no difference between civilian and military for should we respond or decrease troops. In none of the conditions was there any evidence that there should be support for conceding to terrorist demands. And the nationality of the targets ends up mattering for each of the policy elements. For increasing troops, it happens that you only want to increase troops if the attack actually occurred abroad. And in this case, the difference between civilian and military was salient. For other things, we have airports, borders, and domestic surveillance are all domestic domestic concessions that would need to be made for counterterrorism. And there was only support for these if the attack happened on U.S. soil. And nobody liked torture, so that's nice. So the conclusions then, we find support for hypothesis 1 and hypothesis 2, which are our main proximity argument, that physical and personal proximity affect threat perception. And we find no evidence for either the rational choice or the correspondence hypothesis that there should be a support for concessions or counterterrorism associated with whether it's civilian or military. But we do find that physical and personal proximity do matter for policy support. We do find support for hypothesis 8, but we believe that that's just because the proximity is being perceived again. There's no evidence that correspondence theory holds. So our basic conclusions are that personal and physical proximity determine the salience of the threat, that threat perception informs policy preferences both at home and abroad, and that no features of the attacks lead to concessions for terrorist organizations, but there's no evidence that there's a difference between civilian and military casualties. In the future, we hope to extend the experiment, first with an experiment to look at this personal proximity to be more like the attacks in Garissa, Ankara, and Paris. The expectation is that attacks against the US would be most salient, but attacks against the US and the UK would be more salient than attacks against the other countries because of all the points of affinity between nationals from the US and UK. In the next run of experiments, we also want to use student samples so that we can vary whether or not the victims are students, thinking that students will feel more affinity for student victims in foreign countries. Similarly, if we do this on the KU campus, we could have domestic and international attacks, but also attack that happens in either Kansas City or Lawrence, because that proximity effect should be there, as should the student effect as well. And finally, there's an issue where are we not perceiving a difference between civilian and military because we view attacks against nationals as being attacks against people from the United States, or is it that people are just not perceiving the difference between civilian and military targets? So we're going to ask a series of questions in the questionnaire where we identify actual terrorist threats and see if participants can distinguish between the two to try and get at that causal mechanism. So thank you for allowing us to participate, and we look forward to your comments.
Great. Thanks for going first and being great. So I'm going to turn it over to our discussants, and in particular we'd like to try and focus our comments and questions about the puzzle, the research question, the framing of this project, anything related to the contribution, etc. And if you, anyone who has a comment, if you'd want to raise your finger, I'm going to try and put you in a queue, and then when we'll see how well this goes. And then we'll get comments. If the authors need to interrupt, then let me know and we can get a quick answer. Otherwise, we'll kind of bulk your responses to a whole bunch of questions at once. So, who would like to start? Steve.
Hi, I hope you guys can hear me. Is everything working on the audio end?
Yeah.
But yeah, a very interesting project, and I'm really, we kind of start with the discussion of the framing of the puzzle, the motivating puzzle of the manuscript is no doubt very intriguing, and it touches on a lot of comments. I remember, you can see on Twitter about why the Bataclan attack generated more of a reaction than, say, the Boko Haram attacks, which were kind of got ephemeral attention. But on that end, the discussion of 3 similar attacks, one in Turkey, one in Kenya against university students, and another against nightgoers or clubgoers in Paris on a weekend night. That's the kind of motivating puzzle we want to address. Why did Paris generate the reaction it did? But the similar attacks that reached similar fatalities generated the reaction in Kenya and Turkey that they did. And what we end up getting, I think, is a research design that kind of looks at, the differences of what would happen if there was a terrorist attack in Portugal against U.S. civilians or U.S. Military personnel versus what would happen for a similar attack in the United States. And so I don't think the motivating puzzle of why France generates the reaction that it did vis-a-vis Kenya and Turkey kind of implies something that the authors discuss. That is the kind of the personal proximity aspect and the physical proximity aspect of it, because Paris would be closer to the United States, at least from an American perspective, than Kenya or Turkey. But I don't think the frame, at least the frame there, I don't think kind of really leads to the exact kind of research design that we get. I think is where I'm going toward. And then kind of as a final comment, I think a lot of the discussion in the introduction, especially after the 3rd paragraph, like the 4th through the 8th paragraphs, I think are really stuck with the conclusion and kind of talk about some important contributions of what the authors want to do. I think that's stuff that's better for the conclusion section of the paper. And the introduction, I think, should be, could be kind of much more condensed and much more streamlined to focus on how exactly the author believes that the reaction to the Paris attack recently in November suggests that, again, this is more salient because it's more physically and personally proximate to us, which then leads to what the research the authors do in the manuscript.
So, Steve, are you looking for them to show a little bit more of the variation on both dimensions instead of just one case that kind of tries to do both?
Well, it's the discussion there, I think, starts, or the frame starts with France and why France generated the reaction that it did. And what we end up finding is that if it's really close to home, that is, it's in the United States, it tends to generate more of a reaction than if it were even if it were in Portugal, which is a U.S. ally. So I think if the I think if the authors would pursue the frame that they do, especially noting the divergence of the reaction between among France, Kenya, and Turkey, I think they'd want to better highlight, how exactly France is somehow more personally proximate to us, and more, and thus certainly among the 3, more physically proximate to us as well.
Brian.
Okay. Thank you, Emily. Hello. Good afternoon. Good morning, everyone.
Thank you.
Really interesting paper. Really important topic. I'd agree. Really important topic and very interesting use of an experiment. But I would also agree with Kevin's point that the example at the beginning of France versus these other attacks maybe isn't the best, because what the experiment actually gets at is domestic versus foreign. Domestic versus foreign, which I think is quite different from the notion of physical proximity. And when I think about the framing, I think there are sort of two angles you could use. The first being, why do some attracts draw more interest? And the second, how does interest or proximity condition public support for government reactions? And I think the second thing is more interesting, less intuitive, and also gets more directly at what's tested in the experiment. So I would suggest at least thinking about, in the framing, focusing on the second part about how interest or proximity conditions public support for government reactions. And this can get you more into questions like, why do some attacks provoke strong responses and others not? Or why do terrorist attacks sometimes backfire, leading to more U.S. troops when the terrorists want fewer U.S. troops? I think this could be an interesting book to draw people in, more than why do some attacks draw more interest than others. And just one other comment about the intro and the framing would be the normative implications. If you're looking for a way to make it shorter, I would maybe fold the two normative implications into the three contributions that you list, or maybe even remove them altogether, because the introduction is fairly long.
Unmute. Tim.
Okay. I think I'm on. Okay. I think you can hear me.
You are. We can hear you.
Yeah. I didn't have a lot of sort of stuff about the framing. Most of my comments about the research design, but I guess I would just add to what the other two discussants have said. First of all, I liked the study quite a bit. I thought it was interesting, and I think it's certainly important and salient. And I wanted to know what the result of the study was and everything else. I think that's great. This is a minor point, but one of the things that made me have a hard time understanding the pitch and the point of the paper until I kind of read the whole thing, and then hearing the presentation you just made really clarified things for me quite a bit, is that you talk a lot about Abrams' work, and you're using specific pieces of Max's work that are important for your discussion about what expectations we should have, what expectations we should have about an attack's impact on the public's preferences for policies. But a lot of Abrams' work talks about sort of like whether or not terrorism is rational or terrorist groups rational actors. He's pretty skeptical about that. I think you mentioned that in the paper. And that's aside from what you're doing, but it kind of raised in my mind the question of the implications of your theory and your assumptions about, if Max is wrong and groups are strategic, right, and they're selecting venues to attack in, and they're selecting types of attacks to do. And I know your paper's not about what terrorist groups are trying to do strategically, but I wondered about the implications of what your findings are for that. So for example, if it's the case that the publics react differently to different attacks because of where they occur and who the victims are, whether or not they can identify with the victims, whether there's a personal proximity or not, wouldn't you see that in terms of terrorist group behavior? So for example, could we look and see if groups have a certain motivation, they have a certain policy preferred outcome, and they have a certain strategy they're pursuing? They would attack in Kenya sometimes. They wouldn't attack other times. They would pick Paris instead. A group that wanted to kind of provoke a big reaction from the Western public would necessarily structure their attacks to be at targets that are personally proximate or physically proximate to the United States. This is not really what the point of your paper is, but we're talking about Abrams' work about, are groups rational or not? You mentioned this a little bit. I kind of just wondered that. I kind of wondered if that would be, that made me think a little bit about the framing of the paper and about what you're trying to do. Now, I mean, I don't know that you should add a whole section, maybe like in the conclusion you could, about, well, this has implications not only for counterterrorism policy or what we should expect to happen in terms of policy pressures, but like, is this affecting groups' strategic targeting behavior? I mean, I think it kind of has to, doesn't it? I mean, I think it kind of would have to be baked into how groups decide what to attack.
Brian, did you have a thought on that? Oh, And he's gone. Okay, so Clay and Nazli, do you want to take a few minutes and react to anything, or should we move on to the next section?
We can go ahead and. Oh, do you want to react?
So just a.
Can you? Do you have your? Is that muted?
Oh no, we can hear you.
You can hear? Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Just sort of a short reaction in terms of framing the paper. It seems like there are two ways we can go. The first one is focusing more on this hot topic of personal proximity, and then why is it that the public cares more about Paris than others. But then if we were to take, I think, Brian's comments, it's more leaning toward counterterrorism policy. So it kind of ties in with Jim's comment as well. Number one, why do attacks backfire? And then it might be that it's a strategic, endogenous mechanism on the part of terrorist groups where they actually want that reprisal and therefore choose venues based on personal and physical proximity. So it seems like there are two directions we can go with the framing of the paper.
Right. And so I think my reaction to the comments about the framing. Can you hear me right now?
But we can't see you. I don't know if you want to stop sharing your screen so that we could see you.
Can you see me now? Oh, wait, no, wait. I need
No.
to stop sharing my screen. Okay.
Yeah.
So I need
Down
to
at the
go keep-
bottom, and then hopefully.
This is odd. It's not showing up.
There should be a link at the bottom if your window is open that you can stop sharing the screen.
Oh, wait. Sorry. I moved you to a different. So I was like, I can't find that window. All right. Let's see. You are screen sharing. Turn off camera. No. Mute microphone.
No.
There we go.
Okay.
All right.
Perfect.
Yeah. So, two thoughts. The framing. I mean, I think that's right. There is a bit of a disconnect if we think directly about Ankara, Paris, Garissa versus what we're doing in the experiment. I think part of that is because what we wanted to do in the initial experiment is develop a sort of a broader theory about all the elements that could make a terrorist attack salient, right? And so just focusing on the fact that we might have affinity with people in Paris versus not having affinity with people in Ankara or Kenya is, we find that personal affinity effect is important, but we also wanted to allow for the fact that the physical proximity could matter as well. And I think we're in our next run of the experiment, assuming, I'd be interested to know what you all think about the last bit that we had there at the end about how we want to extend the experiment, but that will drive more at getting directly at our framing. The other thing is that in terms of what should we observe terrorists doing, I think the implication that we find is that if you were just thinking about terrorism in terms of policy outcomes, then terrorism is not a rational action because we only find evidence that it increases support for counterterrorism, and the more that you attack closer to a particular population or people more like a particular population, that it increases the probability of the target state taking actions that militate against your success in the future, either because there's domestic counterterrorism policies that make it more difficult for you to operate, or there are aggressive counterterrorism policies where there's more boots on the ground in your territory. And I think the analog that I would draw, maybe if I had to explain, so why then are terrorists just stupid or something? Like, yeah, probably not. I would say this, that similar to the way the economic sanctions literature, sanctions appear to be ineffective, so why do we use economic sanctions? Well, there's an audience outside of the target state that you're trying to target with the behavior. And perhaps the reason we see terrorist groups taking ambitious actions like the attacks in Paris or the attacks in Kenya is that it signals to potential recruits, potential allies that could funnel them resources, that they have capabilities and that they have resolve. And so it doesn't do much in the way of getting the target state to concede, but it is useful in generating support. Now, this is one of those issues where that falls far afield of what we're doing in the experiment itself, but if I had to speculate, that would be sort of my argument about why this fits into that. And I guess I'd be wondering, would you buy that argument, or should we leave that argument out, or is that worth speculating about in the conclusion?
James?
Yeah, I'm sorry that I caused all of this, and I've heard you. I kind of hear what you're saying. And I agree with you. You are correct. I mean, it really is. It is ancillary. It's an implicate. It could be an implication down the road of sort of the patterns you're finding. I don't think you want to. I don't know why in my read of the paper that's kind of where I went. I kind of expected a little bit of discussion about what the implication would be for terrorist group strategies, and you don't really need to. I don't know if you could revise in a way that kind of heads that off to make it clear that's kind of not where you're going with this. And you don't really need to, there's been a lot of work that's been done on that. There's been a lot of work speculating as to why groups engage in terrorism and why would a group commit an attack that's going to result in a response of like a crackdown. Well, there's a whole provocation strategy Kid and Walter talk about. There's kind of logical reasons why that would happen. It's really not what your paper's about, and just if you could, I would just give it one more read just to make sure that you're not priming the reader to kind of think about, well, what does this mean? I mean, does this mean that are you trying to say that we're going to see groups that are going to commit more attacks in places like Paris because they want a certain type of reaction? That's kind of where I went with this. And I think it was the queuing off of Abrams' stuff, because that's kind of what that he's well known for that. I mean, there's sort of this whole idea that terrorist groups don't have a strategic objective. They're trying to demonstrate commitment and find meaning and all that kind of stuff. It's not sort of a strategic thing. If that's a distraction, I don't know a lot what to say with the framing, and if that's a distraction, I apologize. I didn't want to throw you off here.
No. It's all part of the discussion. So let's go ahead and move into any thoughts that you guys might have about the theory or questions about the hypotheses or anything like that. Steve. Sorry, I can't see your hand.
Oh, yeah. Sorry about that. I'll use my right hand.
Okay, Steve.
Yeah, just I really was intrigued, and I think actually one of a very fascinating part of the manuscript talks about breaking apart this concept of salience into 2 dimensions, which then each have 3 dimensions. But I think, and I know this is also getting into the issue of framing, but I think of interest to the authors is really just 2 of them, and that's the idea of physical proximity or geographic location of the event, and the personal proximity, which is, again, how it kind of relates to one's own identity. And in this context, I think the one's identity aspect of it is nationality, really, just U.S. or Portuguese in the context of the experiment. But it has me wondering then, what good is the discussion of, even intensity, when I think intensity at the most matters for the third hypothesis, which or expects that more deaths of compatriots, which I think is proxying quantitative intensity within their framework, leads citizens to be or subjects to be more likely to support concessions. And if the interest is really in just this idea of proximity, I don't think the intensity stuff is really helping, and that'd be, or I don't think it's necessary, certainly. And that's just a starter comment, but.
Let's do Brian, and then we'll do Jim.
Okay, yeah, I would agree that perhaps the theory is a little more complex than it needs to be, because there are a number of things that are not tested. And hypothesis 6, people support domestic counterterrorism as a response to domestic attacks. I'm not sure how surprising this is. So if you were looking for something to reduce, that could be perhaps removed or emphasized less. Regarding the Abrams, I think maybe that the theory section relies on Abrams a little too much when other people have said some of the things that he's famous for saying. With some of the classic stuff, like maybe a little more Crenshaw, Bruce Hoffman, Brian Jenkins, and even regarding the discussion that you all just had, Peter Krause, I think, has a good response to the notion of are terrorist groups rational or not. So that might be worth looking into. One thing that I'm glad you acknowledged in the theory section is that public opinion is not the same thing as elite action, and that there's not a direct link from one to the other, and some people might hit you on that, saying that public opinion doesn't matter much. But I think you could argue a little more, because I believe your argument in this sense. I think you could, for example, show some data that pretty much everything the U.S. government does is supported by public opinion. So if public opinion supports something, it's likely that the U.S. government will do it. So I think you could make that part a little stronger.
Jim.
Yeah, I didn't have a lot. I mean, again, with the theory section, I didn't have a lot to say. I guess I have a literature. It kind of ties into theory a little bit, and it's a little bit different from what's been said. And that is, when I read it, I guess I was expecting to see. There's a lot of ancillary literature that sort of shores up your expectations regarding personal proximity, right, and sort of affinity for empathy towards certain types of people that bad things happen to versus not. Out-group stuff. I think Avdan mentioned this when she was giving the talk, the presentation. There's some of it is, I mean, there's sort of the Huddy stuff that's been cited, and I think he's pretty crucial, central to that. But there's actually a pretty old, pretty large, massive body of work in social psychology that looks at like out-groups, sympathy towards out-groups, a tolerance of out-groups. It's certainly what your paper's about, but there's also been work in that same area that looks at what happens to that when people feel scared and threatened. And I think that you could, I think that a reader might, it really depends on where you send it and who you get as a reviewer, but I think some people might sort of expect some of that, sort of expect a little bit more shoring up in terms of the relevant literature on, the social psych literature on whether or not you have a cultural or ethnic or racial affinity with somebody, the degree to which you sort of afford them, tolerance and rights, which I think has implications for what you're doing. It's sort of, you would also feel sorry for those people. There's been actually some also work on like people's perception of pain for people who are different from them. And that sounds really weird and crazy and different, but from what you're doing, but I think it does kind of fit in anyway. I'd be happy to email with you about that. I had to dive into that for another project. I can let you know some of those citations. I think you might want to kind of bulk up that literature where you talk about biases people have, with that social psych literature that I think is maybe a little bit less commonly cited by political scientists.
Steve, you had a follow-up?
Yeah, it's I think the really interesting aspect of the theoretical section is this idea of personal proximity, and I think it's what connects the framing issues that we discussed and how it starts with the disparity of reaction to France, to Kenya, and to Turkey, to what the researchers actually do. And while this might be kind of a next step of a research project, I'm curious when the authors argue. And again, there's not a lot of this kind of spans page 10 and 11 about what personal proximity does to perceptions of threat and to the policy preferences that follow. Are they arguing, or are the authors arguing that personal proximity, that component is kind of less a fear about a future attack towards someone like them, or is it more about kind of feeling personally part of the attack, and such that an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us, and thus we're all kind of victims in that sense, even if we're not directly victims? And I think whatever kind of implications for threat perception or policy preferences would be consistent with either or. But I'm curious, when the authors talk about personal proximity, is it kind of a fear that they might be next, or is it a fear that, or is it a kind of an idea that they themselves were part of this attack? And so that's why France generated the reaction that it did, is that was an attack on Westerners, and Americans are Westerners, and therefore we identify more strongly than we would with a similar attack with similar damage in Kenya and Turkey. I'll yield the balance of my time.
Yeah, you guys want to answer?
Yeah, so you want to jump in on that?
Okay, so I'll address Jim's comment about the personal proximity and outgroups, since I talked about it a little bit, and that's sort of the aspect of this paper that really fascinates me. So I think he's referring to, like with the earlier literature, the more Tatchfield and Turner on outgroup, in group like 1979, that early 80s. I'm not that familiar with the second leg of the literature that you talked about with pain and affinity, so I'd be interested in reading or at least getting a note of what the citations are. So, and that sort of ties in to what we want to do with that. So I think...
Oh, we lost you. You're muted. Hang on.
Sorry.
Okay.
So I think if we were to do a project, the next leg that Clay summarized at the end of the presentation with looking at, let's say, affinity with US and UK. One of the stumbling blocks there will be, people will ask, how can you know a priori that, let's say, the American public is going to identify with the British public? And there, we were talking about, okay, natural ally, heritage, language similarity, Western culture, etc. But that's where we would probably base our framing on this literature. But even the paper as currently it stands, which is all about national attack versus attacks abroad, I think this still matters. So we can still harness the insights of this literature for the current version of the paper. And linking in with Steve's follow-up comments with personal proximity, the way that I thought about it, or we thought about it, is that it's both, right? It's both, and that's where I said objective and symbolic. So I borrowed on Duckett 2001 within psychology. Objective threats are where you're thinking, okay, I'm at risk because, let's say, other assistant professors have been targeted, or other foreigners, in my case, in the US, have been targeted, civil individuals to me. And then the other component, there is symbolic, is it's actually, oh, it's a threat against our way of life. And that's more about sociotropic as well. So I'd be curious as to know whether it would be feasible to frame it with it's both, or is it better to sort of try to tease those two things apart?
It seems like they would have different implications for how they would connect to policy outcomes, right? If we're just feeling empathetic, that you might support different actions from your government than if you actually are worried that you're next. And so it seems like it could be a factor of salience, but Steve knows more about salience than I do.
So, did someone want to respond to that, or can I ask a question? Or
no, go ahead, Clay.
Yeah, okay. There's a tension with the way the theory is structured right now, and then the way we have the experiment, and I don't know what the best way to go about this is. You know, if we have a question that's as broad as why do we care more about certain types of terrorist attacks, or how do those how do those perceptions affect policy, then the additional dimensions that go untested in the theory seem important. I can imagine a reviewer saying, well, okay, yes, your personal and proximity arguments are true, but you haven't even considered, what if there's a terrorist attack in Kenya where 4,000 people died? Won't people still think that that's important? Or if there's sort of a nuclear bomb that goes off, won't people think that's important? And so we include that for now to sort of, nod at the fact that, we've considered it, we just haven't tested it yet. So the question becomes, do we pull those things out and say that for the sake of this paper, we're just interested in this personal and physical proximity, or we could throw in an experiment, a series of experimental conditions that are really basic, which is just that, in one set of conditions, more people die, and another set of conditions, more people die, and in a more gruesome way, and that gets at the qualitative intensity. But that gets back to the sort of problem with hypothesis 6, is that, well, yeah, I mean, of course, it seems worse if more people die. And so I don't know what is a better use of our sort of space and time, and so what does everybody think? Should we throw in these sort of obvious conditions to test that part of the argument, or should we pull that argument out and not worry about that for now?
Jim.
Yes, I could see a cranky reviewer saying that. There's no question about it, I don't think I think that that's really loading. I mean, you're not saying in the same experiment, right? I mean that would really be super complex. I wouldn't know what was going on then. You know, I think that maybe you would want to just address that in sort of the you know, qualify what, acknowledge all of these are important, unknown, untested questions, but focus on one thing. I mean, I like the idea that you were focusing on kind of this very specific, what I think to be, you know, very important, you know, facet about how people react to terrorism. I don't think if it were my paper, I don't think I would try to do all of that. I mean, I just think that that would just be too much.
Do you think we should do that prior to or in the latter part of the paper? Sort of say at the end, we realize that if more people died in certain places, it would matter more, or should it be prior to getting into the discussion or afterwards?
I wonder if what you could do is you could cast the paper as, you know, something that Brian said. I mean, I think we all kind of understand, or not surprised at least at the outset. I think we all have a suspicion that, you know, who gets attacked and where the attack occurs is going to affect the U.S. public's reaction to the attack and its assessment of threatening, and even the type of policies that should be put into place to go after it. You know, I think that to respond to it, I think that you could sort of start off by saying that, and then you could sort of say this, you know, the literature and the type of empirical work or any type of systematic study on this very thing is pretty spotty, and it is. I mean, we don't really know a lot. That's what's interesting about your study, is to my mind it's the first one that really kind of looks at this from an experimental standpoint, which is I think it's an easy case for you to make that that's the methodology you should use, and no one's done this, you know. And just you could sort of say there's a whole bunch of questions surrounding this, including what happens when the casualty rate is very, very high, what if it's suicide terrorism, what if it's a nuclear attack. All these things are important. They all need to be studied. We focus on what we think is the most basic, or the one component of it, and it's going to be this, you know, who are the victims, and what, you know, do people empathize or not empathize? Do they identify or not identify with them? And I think I would just say hat tip to all the other things and say, as a first step, we're going to break off this one little piece. And I think you could say that you're doing that because no one else has really looked at this systematically at all.
And that's where we would build on social psychology literature as well, sort of to flesh out why people identify, why a terrorist attack breeds affinity and generates empathy.
And that literature is it's old, as you mentioned, and it's vast. You can't cite all of it. And, you know, you just have to kind of hit the major. It sounds like you've done some investigation. You know the major authors. If you could just have those in there, I think that would be kind of a good way to set up the study.
Any other thoughts on those questions? Okay, why don't we switch over to thinking about the research design and the empirical analysis of the project, which is, I'm sure, recent and needs some feedback. James. Jim.
I know people probably have a lot to say about this, and so I just wanted to have a question first. Is this a pilot, or do you see this as a pilot study? I was thinking, you know, people don't like MTurk, and we could talk more about what that means for your study, but I kind of looked at this and thought these are really interesting preliminary findings that they could use to develop a test proposal, a time-sharing experiments in social sciences. I can talk to you more about that afterwards if you'd like me to. But this is neat pilot data. I don't want to downgrade your findings, I'm not trying to say that, but you know, I mean, I looked at this and thought, wow, they could really go after one of these test grants, and if it's successful, TESS will field it for you, and you'll escape all those questions about how representative the sample is. How do you see this? Is this like a paper ready to go, or ready to go plus you're going to do something better than a convenient sample, and so you need grant money or something?
It's not a paper ready to go. We see these as a preliminary set of results. As it stands, our strategy right now was to probably run more MTurk and then do some student samples. Both are samples of convenience, not representative, and then just do, I mean, we don't even attempt to do it in this draft of the paper, but essentially hand-waving about, like, we realize that there's problems with students, there are problems with MTurk, but it's internally valid. so believe us. But no, we should talk after about this time sharing.
Time sharing experiments in social science.
Okay, right. Yes, that would be good. If we can get money to do something like that, then yes, that would be good.
Brian.
If I could make...
Oh, I'm sorry. Nazli was responding really quick.
So I'm looking with tests. I had a few friends from Duke who went that way. I didn't use it myself, but I think before we went in that direction, we would really have to nail down the experiment. And in any case, I think you don't get in. It's basically a competitive grant. That's what I know.
So maybe a kind of challenge. Brian, you want to take it over?
Okay, all right. Yeah, normally when commenting on a survey, paper, or experiment, it's usually not cool to say you should do the survey again. You should ask a different question this time. But since you mentioned that it's that's the plan, and this is a great opportunity, and I think this is a good time to discuss these things. The personal proximity is really interesting, and I'm glad that you're looking for more ways to test that, including students, affinity. I would maybe try to think about additional ways to test this idea of affinity. Regarding physical proximity, as I said, I have an issue with South Carolina as physically proximate to the U.S. because it's in the U.S. Right? I see it as a domestic attack, not foreign, domestic versus foreign. So if you're interested in thinking more about physical proximity, I might suggest asking Americans, how would you feel about an attack in Canada versus an attack in Europe? Something like that. I think that would get more directly at physical proximity while holding a number of things constant. And then just while I'm here, a couple minor notes. Tables 5 and 7, it might be helpful to have percentages there, just to make it a little more clear.
Steve agrees.
Okay. Percentages. And I didn't understand why there are 2 columns under each option in table 6 and 8. So that's just like sort of a minor question. 6, 2 columns.
I've got a 2-finger from Jim, and then we can come back to Brian if you're not finished.
Yeah, no, go ahead. Sorry, that's all.
Okay. Actually, Jim and then Steve.
It was a 1-finger, and so I'm gonna let someone else go. It was a new thing, so don't.
Okay. Okay, so let's do Steve and then Jim.
On the MTurk thing, I know this is a huge debate among social scientists. I'm of the mentality MTurk is probably fine, and really like Gelman and his colleagues have something at the International Journal of Forecasting where they take like Xbox data, which is among the most non-random data on the planet, and they make it nationally representative, and they better forecast the 2012 presidential election than a lot of professional pundits or professional polls have done. So, or at least in their analysis. I mean, if it comes up, and goodness knows it will, you may want to kind of use that tool they use. It's multi-level regression with post-estimation stratification. So you take the areas where MTurk is known to be kind of biased from a truly representative random sample, and that is MTurkers are typically what? They typically make less than the median income. They're typically more liberal. They're typically more likely to be college educated or within college, and they're typically younger. You just weight the estimates that you get. I mean, someone's going to bring it up, but I don't think that necessarily makes. I don't think it all makes the sampling frame biased beyond repair or anything close to it. But that comment about MTurk and my sympathy for it aside, I have kind of 2 questions about the 2 of the proxies. And again, one of the proxies there is for personal travel, the personal travel metric, which is, are you more likely to travel to Portugal now after hearing about this attack on the Azores? But again, the problem with that metric, and probably why you don't find anything with it, is that there's no latent probability of would I travel to Portugal in the first place. That's not a commentary on Portugal, by the way. It's probably a very lovely place, but again, people have different means, they have different interests. Maybe they don't want to go to Portugal. Maybe they equate it as like with Spain, things are bad there, the economy, whatnot. Let me go to someplace else. I mean, the personal travel metric there, one of the reasons probably why you're not finding anything is that it doesn't give me, there's no estimated change from a latent level of interest in going to Portugal. And the kind of second one, and I think that this is probably a really important one, so you want to think about it, especially if it comes up in the context of review. I think you're proxying counterterrorism by reference to the domestic surveillance metric, which asks, are you in favor of increasing security at the U.S. borders as a result of this attack either in Charleston or in Portugal? But increasing security is kind of catch-all, and I would think, yeah, okay, let's make sure something similar doesn't happen again if it happens at that North Charleston Joint Military Base. But is that really kind of getting at counterterrorism? Is increased border strength or increasing security at the U.S. borders really getting at this kind of nebulous concept of counterterrorism that's become very politically charged of late? And I think you'll want to think of something that kind of better approximates the changes in policy preference beyond a rather benign change for increase of security at the U.S. borders. I'll yield to Jim.
Okay, Jim.
Yeah, I had a couple questions about the design, and again, it's like Brian said, cake's baked. You know what I mean? You've already run the study, but I'm interested to hear that you may want to do follow-ups or other types of things to do. Okay, so here goes. You selected a Portuguese group in Portugal. I just thought that was weird. I didn't really understand. I would like to hear, I mean, if you could have a rationale for that. So the vignettes are about a Portuguese group, a Portuguese venue for some of the treatments. There's not really, terrorism isn't an issue in Portugal. I don't know that people know or don't know that, but it certainly doesn't stand out as a threatening place. It's not an Islamist group. It's not the perpetrator of this group, of this attack is not the type of terrorism people think about. If you're trying to make the respondent feel threat, I'm not sure that this does it. So why didn't you use an Islamist group like ISIS or Daesh, whatever, and why didn't the attack occur in Africa versus the United States? Why not the Middle East? What are the other thing is, so you pick Portugal, but that could be a society where there is personal proximity with the United States in a lot of ways. You know, I mean, you start off the paper by saying, well, there's a reason why people got so freaked out about Paris, and that's because it's the West. Well, this is the West too. If you could just think about more about next time you do this, the design, like why wouldn't you make it maybe piggybacking on what Brian has said, maybe your two cases should be a Western European country that's more physically and personally proximate to the United States, and somewhere else, I mean Kenya or Pakistan or whatever. This is a low casualty event. I don't know, maybe you want to make that higher. I'm not sure what that does. Talking about MTurk and your sample, you know, there is controversy about that. We've already talked about that, but you know, I wanted to know who the people were in the sample. Like who? I mean, you don't have any descriptives on them in the paper that I read. Please put some descriptives in. Who are they? Did you weight the response? Did you weight them the way that has been suggested? What was the response rate? What's the completion rate of this? I think there's a completion time. You said on average people took like 15 minutes. You know, how many people started this and didn't finish it? This is something that, you know, if you send this piece to POQ or something like that, they're going to ask you about that. How balanced are your treatments? Now, I think that in one of your tables, they are hard to read. I mean, the one where it's the average scores are hard to read. I tried to find out in each treatment, each condition, how many people are they balanced? How many are in each? They're randomly assigned. I get that, but do you achieve balance across them? I mean, can you just assure us that each of these treatments are mini representations of your whole sample, or as best as possible? I know you did a random process to assign them. I had thought that you told the respondents ahead of time the vignettes are fictitious, but I'm wrong about that. In your presentation you did now, you assure them at the end it's fictitious, and that's fine. That's fine. I don't think you want to tell them ahead of time if you are doing that. I think you want them to this is going to bias their perception of threat, and so
we tell them before and after, and the IRB says like you need to tell them hypothetical before and after. I mean, and because I guess the IRB here, deception is like a much nastier issue for them. Okay. So we told them before and after. Yeah.
Okay, well, IRB is IRB. You know, you can't. They're not going to be able to have it. You know, I haven't done a lot of this type of work at all, but I use deception. I've used deception. I mean, I would never. I think you want to. I mean, if the IRB says no, you can't do it, I guess. But I think you do want to.
IRB probably will say that you can. You just have to justify why it's important and verify that you're going to deal with it afterward, right? So I don't think it's a. I mean, I don't know your IRB, but it's probably that you can do it. You just have to be very careful to justify it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Because otherwise, I mean, how are you doing? I mean, certainly placebo tests have to employ deception, right? And so, but anyway, I think if you can do it, I think you want to do that. I think in your vignettes, you talk about how the Laos and Charleston airports are used by tourists. I didn't know what that meant in terms of your civilian versus non-civilian treatment. I mean, it seemed to me that one way to read all the vignettes is that there's civilians in all of them, which I don't think you intend. And maybe I'm wrong about that. I thought I'd seen that. Maybe the vignette should also talk about how threatening the group is. You might want to have a thing. This is a group that's attacked before, or blah, 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 you know, that kind of stuff. I have no idea what the DEC tracer is, the DEC tracer, if you could explain what that is. Okay. I agree with Brian about your presentation of the raw. I have this all written down. I can email it to you too if you want to, if that would help.
That'd be good. Yeah.
Okay. The presentation of the raw averages were hard to read. The regressions were better. I thought they made sense. I'd like to see them with the controls. I was curious about them. I do understand that, like, you don't even talk about, you do have controls, you know, which are features of the respondents. I mean, they're political, I think it was age and income and all that kind of stuff. What about, I mean, if you want to present the averages, I mean, why not difference tests or something that kind of helps me a little bit? I didn't understand why you use an OLS model in table 3. Maybe I'm wrong. Isn't the dependent variable ordinal?
It is. Yeah. I mean, 0 to 10. It's just that the ordinal probit on an 11-point scale is, I mean, it's just ridiculous looking. I don't know. So yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You want to have it at least in an appendix.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that would be the plan. Is like have the ordinal probit and the appendix, but you get. I checked it. Same inference. So just for the sake of like easier to interpret the coefficients, if you get the same inference kind of thing, why not just use OLS? But yeah.
Okay. That's fine. That's fine. I didn't realize it was that many. There were that many ordinal scale. This ordinal scale was that big. Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
Low-hanging fruit, though, for a cranky reviewer that wants to that wants to reject. You know, make sure that we understand that. Do respondents know what enhanced interrogation is? You call it torture in the results, but it's in the dependent variable questionnaire. It's enhanced interrogation. I would just pick like maybe 1 or 2 common applications. Like call it waterboarding or indefinite detention. Don't call it torture. You know. I just would kind of, people are probably going to know what waterboarding is. They're going to know what indefinite detention is, you know. I don't know that I would say, do you support enhanced interrogation? You know, I don't know that the respondent would do that. And I also couldn't figure out the columns. They need more labels, right? I had the same problem that Brian did. That was my comments on the.
I've got a 2-finger from Brian and then from Steve. Oh, I can't hear Brian. Hang on. Still can't hear you. Still can't hear you. Sorry. You're still muted. Okay.
All right. Should be good now. Just a very minor thing, because it came to mind when Jim was talking. I wanted to make sure to mention it, that this notion of race, that this for some people is enormous. And forgive me for mentioning it, but I wrote something on the monkey cage about the Paris attacks, and a lot of the responses were like, no, it's all about race. So one advantage of Portugal is that's, you know, more or less being held constant. But I mean, I get the idea of thinking about, you know, with your vignette, with your anecdotes at the beginning of the manuscript, there's a difference in race there, or at least ethnicity. So that's something to think about and maybe be more aware of. But that was all just a minor note.
Steve.
Yeah, Brian beat me to the punch on the race component, but yeah, it's just unmistakable. You know, it's the elephant in the room, and it's probably if that's an extension of this research design, you know, if you deploy it back to the field, that's going to be a really interesting finding to uncover whether or not, especially among the control variables, which I really wanted to see what those were in the regression tables. Do white respondents think differently? Do black respondents think differently? And if we follow Jim's idea to maybe extend kind of this personal proximity element to include Canada versus Western Europe versus Sub-Saharan Africa, then that could be a very interesting, probably a different paper by itself. So, and also another minor comment to kind of pick up on, I think, what Jim was talking about. It took me a while to figure out what exactly how the variables were coded for the threat perceptions, and those were on 0 to 10. With the exception of the personal travel scale, because if they're 0 to 10, 0 is not threatening and 10 is very threatening, and I don't know what that means for the travel question. At least as it's phrased, and I don't see, at least in Table 4, the discussion of Paul's response variables. I think at least one is ordinal or a 3-part ordinal, and I think the remaining ones are binary, yes and no.
They're all the policies are binary, and yeah.
That's definitely information you would want to put in the research design section and not in the results section.
Yeah, I apologize. I don't know how that.
Variables until I got the results. So.
Okay. So.
Take it away, guys.
All right. So the first thing.
And we're going to do about 5 more minutes, and then we're going to end. Although, if you guys want to hang out and keep talking, you're welcome.
Okay, then I will limit it to something that sort of stuck out. The why not Islam, why not the Middle East, why not race a little bit, right? And I think it gets back at this point to hold all of that constant, right? What we didn't want polluting our results, the reason we chose Portugal because it's relatively innocuous, right? We want people to not know much about the state where the terrorist organization is from, to have strong sort of biases about the terrorist organization in advance, because we don't want people's sort of weird perceptions about Islam, seeping into the results if our experimental factors in this experiment are about where is the attack and my affinity for the victims, right? We have sort of another research design in the future addressing a different question, which is essentially getting at how the features of the terrorist organization affect the perceived attack, right? What are their demands? Are they Islamic? Or do they have religious affiliations, etc.? And so that's why we chose sort of a group that you've never heard of and kept the casualty rate relatively low, and we just wanted to get the difference between those things. I think that the the comment about race is correct, and I think that something we're trying to do in the next set of experiments is U.S., U.K., and I think certainly Canada or Mexico to sort of get at this personally proximate issue again as well. Having a set of countries where the U.S. and the U.K. have sort of more ties, and maybe the U.S., U.K., and Canada have more ties, but say Tanzania, Singapore, and a country in the Middle East, Oman, I think is what we had listed. That we could get at a lot of these other dimensions by choosing countries that stratify along different, like how much affinity would there be, how much distance is there between them.
So I think with that there are sort of 2 issues with that. One is, do you actually build into an experiment this issue that everybody's suspecting that, okay, attacks in the Middle East are perceived differently, and right now we're shying away from that. But there's also the issue of, in the vignette, do respondents actually perceive this to be a threatening incident that actually occurs? And then there's a way to still do that while still keeping Portugal, Canada. If we add, I think, some sort of sentiment about, okay, this group has launched attacks in the past, etc. And then with the Lajes airports, why we had the tourists, that was to emphasize that civilians could be targeted.
Which might be why we're not that could be one of the reasons we're not finding the difference between the civilian and military if it's being perceived as civilian every time. So that might be something worth changing.
Great. Well, I would like to thank all of you very much for participating. I'd like to thank the authors for sharing this work with us, and good luck as you continue to revise it. It looks like it's going to be really well received, and so good luck. Thank you to the discussants for giving your time and your thoughts. If you have written up any comments, you're welcome to send them to the authors. I appreciate everybody who has or will tune in to this workshop. So in the future, we have another one in 2 weeks, and it looks a little bit at decentralization and protest. And so it'll be same bat time, same bat channel next time, and hopefully we'll see all of you then. Thank you so much for participating. Thanks for
Thank you very much. Thank you for all of your
it's my
comments.
pleasure.
Yeah.